In a war that shaped a nation, countless faces fought in silence, unseen, unpraised, forgotten by time, but their stories still burn in the shadows of history. Tonight, we uncover the untold faces of the American Revolution. The American Revolution is remembered in classrooms and monuments as a story of great men: Washington crossing the Delaware, Adams speaking fire in Congress, Jefferson writing the immortal words that still echo across centuries. But behind the portraits, behind the ink and marble, there lived thousands of forgotten souls whose sacrifices shaped independence just as surely as the muskets at Lexington or the parchment in Philadelphia. Their names rarely appear in textbooks, their portraits were never painted, yet they bled, they prayed, they fought, they endured. This is the story of those unseen faces, the ordinary people who pushed the American Revolution forward without ever stepping into the light of fame. The revolution did not begin with muskets. It began in whispers, whispers carried by cobblers hammering leather in small town shops, women drawing water from wells, enslaved men working tobacco fields under the watch of overseers, farmers repairing fences under the gray skies of New England. The idea of liberty grew not in Congress, but in kitchens, in taverns, in slave quarters, in the uneasy minds of men and women who had lived their entire lives believing that the distant king across the ocean was the keeper of their fate. In the small town of Marblehead, Massachusetts, lived a fisherman named Elias Turner. He was not a leader, not a soldier, not a scholar. He was a man who had endured storms harsher than politics, waves taller than speeches. When British officers seized local ships to supply their own navy, Elias watched friends lose their livelihoods in a matter of hours. That night, under the dim lantern glow of a dock warehouse, fishermen gathered to talk. They spoke not of rebellion but of survival. Elias stood quietly at the edge of the group listening. He did not understand politics, but he understood tyranny when he saw it. When his nets were taken, his boat boarded, and his brother beaten for resisting inspection, he realized that the revolution was not a choice, it was a necessity. In the same year, hundreds of miles away in Charlestown, a young enslaved man named Samuel Brant listened to the whispers of freedom. His master, a prominent loyalist, frequently hosted British officers. Samuel overheard conversations about coming conflict, about colonial unrest, about Washington and Adams and men who dared to speak of liberty, liberty, a word Samuel had no right to claim. But when word spread that the British were promising freedom to any enslaved man who escaped and served the crown, Samuel faced an impossible crossroads. Should he fight for the very empire that had enslaved him? Or should he run toward the patriot cause, which preached liberty but often denied it to men of his color? Samuel chose something greater than promises. He chose hope. One rain-soaked night he fled, following secret paths through marsh and pine until he reached the encampments of the Continental Army. Suspicious soldiers captured him, but instead of punishment, he was offered a test: carry messages between camps, deep through enemy lines where capture meant certain death. Without hesitation, Samuel agreed. He had no uniform, no weapon, only a conviction that any risk was worth the chance to carve his own place in a world that had never acknowledged him. His name would never appear in the letters of generals, but his footsteps carried secrets that shaped battles. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, the heartbeat of the revolution throbbed beneath crowded streets. Congress debated independence in rooms lit by candles, but true passion for freedom simmered far from those polished floors. A seamstress named Abigail Hart worked near the State House. She stitched torn coats for delegates and soldiers, but with every needle stroke, she stitched herself into the revolution too. She listened to arguments drifting through open tavern windows, arguments about rights, taxes, representation. She saw the weary faces of militiamen who came to her shop with ripped sleeves and boots worn thin from marching. They spoke to her not as a seamstress but as a confidant, as someone who would not judge their fears. Abigail learned not from books but from the raw voices of men who risked death with every step. Her shop became an unofficial listening post, a place where messages passed hands quietly, where rumors were verified or dismissed. She never carried a musket, but she carried information that often traveled farther than bullets could reach. And beyond the settled towns, on the frontiers where war meant something different, native communities faced a dangerous dilemma. Some saw the British crown as a shield against colonial expansion. Others believed the patriots offered a future where they might negotiate new terms of coexistence. For the Oneida Nation, the choice carved their destiny. Among them was a young warrior named Cariuni, not yet 20, known for his sharp senses and calm judgment. The elders debated endlessly, but Cariuni listened to the heartbeats of both sides. He had watched colonists and British alike violate promises, seize land, and betray agreements. Yet he sensed that if the Oneida remained still, they would be swept away by whichever side won. So he advocated something bold, a fragile alliance with the Americans. His counsel helped unite factions within his village, and when the Oneida warriors marched to support the Continental Army at Oriskany and later at Valley Forge, they carried with them not just weapons, but a belief that survival required courage not only in battle, but in difficult decisions. Cariuni would not live long enough to see the outcome of the war, but his community's choice echoed through history. These were not the patriots remembered in marble. They were farmers, fishermen, enslaved runaways, native allies, seamstresses, and wanderers. Yet their stories converged on the same roads, the same battle smoke, the same hope. As the conflict deepened, hunger stalked the Continental Army like a silent predator. Winter at Valley Forge became a test of the human spirit. Soldiers wrapped in threadbare coats collapsed beside smoking campfires. Men who had once held plows or quills now scavenged for bark to boil into broth. Among the camps moved a woman named Rachel Ambrose, whose husband had died in the early months of the war. She had followed the army not as a soldier's wife, but as a healer. Using herbs, roots, and the remedies taught by her grandmother, she treated fever, infection, frostbite. She held dying men in her arms, whispering prayers they were too weak to say themselves. Her hands were cracked from cold water, but she never stopped. Officers rarely spoke her name. Official records barely acknowledged women like her, but the men who survived because of her never forgot. Every life she saved became another beating heart for the revolution. Across the sea, the world mocked the colonies. A handful of farmers could not stand against the greatest empire on earth. Britain believed the rebellion would collapse within months. But the revolution was not driven by muskets. It was driven by people like Elias and Samuel and Abigail and Rachel, whose determination could not be measured on a battlefield map. Then came the turning point, the Battle of Saratoga. While generals debated strategy, it was ordinary militia who formed the backbone of resilience. A boy only 16, Thomas Redfield, marched into that battle carrying a drum instead of a rifle. He kept rhythm for soldiers older and stronger than him, his heartbeat syncing with theirs. When bullets tore through the air and men fell around him, Thomas did not stop. His drumbeats kept the lines moving, kept panic from spreading, kept hope alive. Later, when victory arrived, officers praised strategy and leadership, but soldiers remembered the boy who drummed through hell. In the chaotic months that followed, spies worked in shadows. One of the most extraordinary was a woman known to history only as Agent 355, though her real identity has never been confirmed. But her story mirrors countless women who risked everything to gather intelligence. Perhaps she was a maid in a loyalist household, or a merchant's daughter with access to British officers, or a quiet widow living unnoticed among soldiers. Whoever she was, she passed coded messages to Patriot agents, exposing plots that threatened the very core of the revolution. She moved unnoticed through rooms filled with men who believed women incapable of political thought, but in her silence she shaped the war more profoundly than many generals. On the southern front, the fight grew brutal. Guerrilla warfare turned plantations and swamps into battlefields. In South Carolina, a man named Jacob Hall, born poor, raised rough, became part of a militia group that fought not for ideals but for the land under their feet. He had never heard the full text of the Declaration. He could not read, but he owned a small patch of soil his father had carved from the wilderness, and when British forces burned farms belonging to rumored patriots, Jacob understood that neutrality was no longer an option. He took up arms, joining a band of backcountry fighters who knew every bend of every river. Their attacks were swift, unorthodox, terrifying for the enemy. History books often reduce them to footnotes, but their relentless pressure kept the revolution alive in the South. Years passed. The war dragged on longer than anyone expected. Many of the untold faces never lived to see the end. Elias Turner died at sea, trying to deliver supplies to American troops during a storm. Samuel Brant was captured near Charleston and escaped only by leaping from a British supply barge into darkness. Abigail Hart's shop burned during a Loyalist raid, yet she rebuilt it and continued her quiet work. Rachel Ambrose disappeared during the march to Yorktown. Rumors said she stayed behind to care for wounded prisoners. Cariuni of the Oneida died from fever before the final surrender. But their legacies marched on. Finally came Yorktown, the climax of a struggle built as much by anonymous hands as by celebrated leaders. As British cannons thundered and French ships blockaded the harbor, people like Thomas the drummer boy, Samuel the messenger, and dozens of unrecorded heroes played their parts in the seemingly impossible victory. When the British laid down their arms, when silence replaced cannon smoke, when the first breath of independence settled on the land, the world witnessed the triumph of a nation, but the nation itself did not see the thousands whose stories had made that triumph possible. Inside taverns and meeting halls, where candles trembled against old wooden walls, the revolution grew in the hearts of everyday people. These were the places where whispers carried more truth than speeches, where farmers, merchants, runaway apprentices, and widowed mothers found themselves united by a single belief that a life lived under the weight of injustice was no life at all. Many of their names were never written down, but their courage was carved into every message carried through the night, every oath spoken over flickering flame. Couriers rode dangerous miles to deliver messages that could change the course of the war. They braved forests thick with British patrols, roads haunted by bandits, and nights so cold that breath froze midair. These riders, some barely more than boys, risked hanging if caught, yet they rode anyway, guided not by glory, but by the hope that their small contribution might help secure a better future. They never asked for recognition. They simply carried the revolution on their shoulders, one message at a time. Women played a far greater role in the revolution than history often remembers. Some hid messages beneath floorboards or stitched secrets into their clothing. Others acted as spies, gathering information from occupying soldiers who underestimated them simply because they were women. Many cooked, cared for the wounded, and sustained entire communities while husbands and sons fought miles away. Their sacrifices held the fragile thread of society together, weaving strength into every corner of the war effort. Enslaved men and women faced choices no free person could imagine. Some fought for the British, promised freedom for their loyalty. Others joined the Continental Army, believing the Revolution's promise of liberty might finally include them. Many more resisted quietly, helping pass information or sabotaging the very system that enslaved them. Their stories are full of heartbreak and bravery, stories that shaped a nation even when the nation did not yet acknowledge them. On countless battlefields, where smoke curled over broken earth and the air still trembled with the memory of musket fire, men who had no desire for war found themselves fighting to defend the only life they knew. Many never returned home. Those who did carried invisible wounds, grief for lost brothers, memories that echoed long after the cannons fell silent, and the burden of knowing freedom had been paid for with the highest price. Behind the lines, craftsmen, blacksmiths, carpenters, tanners kept the wheels of revolution turning. They worked endless hours with limited materials, repairing muskets, shaping bullets, crafting boots, and building wagons. Their workshops became lifelines for the army. Without them, guns would jam, soldiers would march barefoot, and the fragile supply lines would collapse. These unsung builders of the revolution rarely stepped onto the battlefield, yet their work shaped every victory that followed. Indigenous nations were caught in an impossible struggle, pressured by both the British and the Americans to choose a side. Some tribes allied with the Crown, believing it offered the best chance to protect their lands. Others cautiously sided with the revolutionaries, hoping for respect and independence after the war. Many refused to join either, choosing instead to protect their people from a conflict that was never theirs to begin with. Their choices were complex, rooted in survival, and deeply misunderstood by history. While armies clashed, families left behind fought their own battles. Farms had to be tended, animals cared for, children raised, all while uncertainty hung over their homes like a storm cloud. Mothers plowed fields alone, repaired fences, and defended their land when danger came. Every day without news became a test of endurance. Their quiet strength held communities together when the world threatened to fall apart. The soldiers who endured brutal winters, especially at places like Valley Forge, fought not just the British but hunger, frostbite, and disease. They wrapped their feet in rags when boots fell apart, shared crumbs of bread, and huddled around weak fires that barely kept the cold at bay. Many had no formal training, no steady pay, and no certainty of survival. Yet something kept them there: loyalty to comrades, hope for freedom, or perhaps the simple refusal to surrender to tyranny. Letters carried the heartbeat of the revolution. In them, soldiers shared hopes, fears, and promises to return. Families read each line with trembling hands, sometimes rejoicing at good news, sometimes collapsing in grief. These fragile pieces of paper traveled through storms, enemy lines, and miles of wilderness just to reach the people who needed them most. They preserved humanity in a time when the world seemed determined to tear it away. Pamphlets and newspapers became weapons of their own. In hidden basements and cramped workshops, printers risked arrest to produce writings that challenged authority and spread revolutionary ideas. Their presses clattered through the night, turning raw courage into ink and paper. These words sparked debates in taverns, inspired volunteers to enlist, and awakened a sense of unity among people who had once felt powerless. Without the printed word, the revolution's fire might never have spread so far. Field doctors fought a different kind of battle. With limited tools and almost no medicine, they worked in tents filled with cries of pain and the metallic smell of blood. They improvised splints from broken wagon parts, boiled water over campfires, and performed surgeries that tested the limits of human endurance. Many doctors collapsed from exhaustion, yet they kept going, driven by duty to save lives even when hope seemed distant. Their hands shaped miracles in the darkest corners of the war. Even children were touched by the revolution. They watched fathers march away, saw soldiers pass through their towns, and felt the tension that settled over their homes like an unspoken warning. Yet children also carried hope. They fetched water for camps, tended small animals, and listened to stories that kept their spirits alive. In a world shaken by conflict, their innocence became a reminder of what the revolution truly sought to protect: the promise of a better tomorrow. As the war dragged on, the revolution became more than a fight for independence. It became a mosaic of different people bound by a shared dream. Rich and poor, young and old, free and enslaved, immigrants and natives, they all played a role. Their contributions varied, but their determination was the same. They believed in the idea of a nation that valued liberty, even if that idea was imperfect. Their unity became the revolution's greatest strength. When the final battles ended and negotiation tents replaced battlefields, the cost of the revolution became painfully clear. The land was scarred, families were broken, and thousands of unnamed heroes had given everything for a dream they might never see realized. Yet in those fragile beginnings of peace there was also pride, a quiet understanding that ordinary people had accomplished the extraordinary. A new nation was being born, shaped not only by its leaders, but by the countless unseen hands that carried it through war. For those who returned home, the world felt familiar yet changed. Fields had gone untended, neighbors had moved away, and the quiet roads they once walked now carried the heavy memory of war. Many veterans struggled to rebuild their lives, haunted by what they had seen. And yet, in the embrace of family and the sight of their homeland rising from hardship, they found the strength to begin again. Their resilience became the foundation upon which the young republic would stand. The raising of a new flag marked the beginning of a nation still uncertain of its future. It fluttered above forts, town halls, and battered encampments, carrying with it the hopes of millions. But the flag itself was more than a symbol of victory. It was a tribute to the people who had bled, sacrificed, and endured for the ideals it represented. Each thread echoed the voices of the forgotten, the silent laborers of the Revolution, whose contributions ran deeper than history books could capture. Yet for every celebrated hero, there were hundreds more whose names slipped quietly into the folds of time. The spy who vanished after delivering her final message, the enslaved man who fought for a freedom he was never granted. The mother who kept her family alive against impossible odds, the blacksmith who forged tools until his hands cracked. Their stories rarely appear in museums or monuments, yet they are the heartbeat of the revolution, the ones who carried the struggle on their backs. Over the centuries, many records vanished, lost to fire, decay, or the careless passing of time. But even without written proof, the impact of these forgotten revolutionaries remains etched into the fabric of the nation they helped create. Their sacrifices whisper through the pages that survived, through family stories passed down in fragments, and through the freedoms enjoyed today. They may not have monuments, but their legacy endures in the very existence of the country they helped forge. The American Revolution was not shaped solely by generals or statesmen, but by countless ordinary people who dared to believe in something greater than themselves. Their courage lit the path toward independence, and their sacrifices became the silent pillars of a new nation. To unveil their stories is to honor the truth that history is built not only by those whose names are remembered, but by those whose lives, though forgotten, changed the world forever.